In other news, funeral preparations have gotten underway over in Iran for the country's former supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who was assassinated by the US and Israel on the 28th of February. The public funeral is set to start Saturday with a burial scheduled for next Thursday. Now, the US and Iran concluded a round of indirect talks in Qatar's capital yesterday, and according to Doha, there was progress made. Those discussions are expected to resume after Khamenei's funeral. For more on all of this, we can bring in Scott Lucas, Professor of US and International Politics at the Clinton Institute at University College Dublin. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us on the program today. How stable is this ceasefire which we have in place between the US and Iran? Because we saw the MOU signed, then we saw the US hit targets in Iran after accusing the Islamic Republic of violating that truce after it struck a Panama flag tanker. It seems that nothing is set in stone.
No, we're in limbo, and we need to acknowledge that, despite the Qatari statement that there are progress in the indirect talks. And that's because of a fundamental, both in the talks and in the military situation, which is Iran's control of the Strait of Hormuz. The Trump administration, in part because of a rash decision by Donald Trump, effectively gave Iran the initiative over the strait when it accepted the memorandum of understanding. That memorandum of understanding really proposes an Iran management of the strait. Iranians would like to management alongside the Gulf state of Oman. Now, the U.S. really doesn't want that. The U.S. doesn't want the Iranians in control of it. So what are they trying to do? They're trying to set up a lane of shipping along the Omani coast where ships can go out without Iranian permission. When the Iranians don't like that, they issue a signal by attacking a couple of the ships. When they do that, then the Americans launch military attacks on ports and on military sites on the southern Iranian coast. And every so often this happens. Now, it's never to the point of breaking the ceasefire down, both sides step away. But what happens if it escalates on one of these occasions? And that brings us to the talks, which is the Iranians have succeeded in making the Strait of Hormuz the primary issue rather than their nuclear program. They have leverage over that issue, and the Americans are trying to hold out against acknowledging that, because if the Americans acknowledge that Iranian leverage, they not only have to accept Iranian management of the strait, but they have to confirm that Iran will get billions, indeed up to tens of billions, even hundreds of billions of dollars in return for allowing shipping to be resumed.
So you're talking about tolls through the Strait of Hormuz, because that's what Iran seemed to understand of the MOU, that after a 2-month period, it would be charging tolls. But Donald Trump said that would not be the case.
They won't call it tolls. I need to emphasize this because the Gulf states have said, we won't pay tolls. We don't want that to happen. They're going to call it something else. They may call it a maintenance fee. They may call it a maritime fee. They may call it an environmental charge, but it's still a payment for ships to go through the Strait of Hormuz. And of course, until February 28th, ships didn't have to pay this fee because the waterway was under the UN Convention on Laws of the Sea, where you had free passage.
Let's continue with the Strait of Hormuz for just a second, because obviously, as the Strait of Hormuz has been shut, there were, the waterway would have been mined by Iran, and the French and the Brits essentially have volunteered to help demine the Strait of Hormuz, but the Iranians say they would be demining the Strait of Hormuz. So what about that operation? Is that going to be stuck in limbo, and is it the Islamic Republic that will be calling the shots on who demines the waterway?
It's an important point, but it's a moot point until you get a long-term ceasefire, because the European powers made clear going back to March, when the Trump camp asked them to save the Americans effectively by sending in naval forces. No, we can't do that while there's the prospect of attacks going on, which there still are, as we've just mentioned. Now, once we get a long-term ceasefire, this will be bound up with the terms that turn the memorandum into a deal. And that is not only who has charge for overseeing the strait, but who has charge of the demining operations. I suspect what you're looking at is the Iranians would still be managing the strait, but would there be an international consortium that would work with them? But to highlight how serious this issue is and why shipping through the strait is not going to resume to its pre-war levels, it's not just that the Iranians have placed mines in the strait, but mines drift in the strait. They don't stay in one place. So shippers and insurers, even if they think their ships are not going to attack, don't know exactly where the mines are at this current time, which is why you'll have very, very limited traffic until we can get a final deal and get these operations organized.
Another element in all of this that risks destabilizing this very, very fragile ceasefire is, of course, Israel. Israel felt that it was sidelined when this MOU was signed and negotiated between the United States and Iran. Yesterday, we had the Israeli defense minister who essentially went and said that the IDF would remain in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Syria on a permanent basis. So there may be rifts that have appeared with Washington, but at the end of the day, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has his own political future to think about.
It's not just political future, it's greater Israel. I mean, call it what it is. And that is that the Netanyahu government wanted regime change in Iran. It did not get that. But at the same time, it had another front where it was fighting in Lebanon to establish control up to 10 kilometers deep and possibly beyond in southern Lebanon. You can call that a buffer zone. They call it a security zone, but it's occupation. And what you've heard from not only the Israeli defense minister, but from Prime Minister Netanyahu in recent days is this is an indefinite area of occupation, just as they have an indefinite area of occupation of 60% of Gaza. And yes, they have that area in southern Syria, not as well known, that they're occupying. So that's why the question will now become not will Israel occupy these areas? It will. The question will become twofold. One is, will you effectively have the tacit acceptance of the Lebanese government and of Hezbollah to that zone of occupation? And secondly, beyond that, will the Iranians, for the sake of a deal from the Americans, especially one where they may get hundreds of billions of dollars, will they accept that Israeli zone of occupation in southern Lebanon and say that should not stand in the way of a deal?
Because it appears that they would not accept it. From what Iran's statements have been in the past, they have been demanding that Israeli forces withdraw from all of Lebanon. And again, it goes to show that if Israel is insisting on this and the Iranians are insisting on control of the Strait of Hormuz, we're back to square one and we're nowhere close to ending this conflict.
Yeah, I think if you look at the Iranians' action, however, and I'm sorry to sound so cynical, but this is what happens, is that the Iranians have responded, including with missile strikes inside Israel, when the Israelis have attacked Beirut, specifically that southern suburb of Beirut, where a lot of the center of Hezbollah is located. The reality, I think, here is that if the Israelis stop attacking Beirut, and if Hezbollah can continue to survive, and it has been badly damaged, remember, going back to 2024, when Israel carried out assassinations, including of its leader, Hassan Nasrallah, if in fact Hezbollah is allowed to survive, and if Beirut is not attacked, then Iran may go with a live and let live acceptance of what happens in the south of Lebanon for now, because they want to get some sense of stability, because they need recovery in their country. They have been, of course, suffered hundreds of billions of dollars of damage, as well as the assassination of their leader in the past 3.5 months.
So just final question, going back to what you were saying earlier, that the Strait of Hormuz has now become the central issue, overtaking Iran's nuclear ambitions, which seem to have been placed once again on the back burner.
Yeah, there were a couple of Iranian officials, and it's interesting in terms of when they figured this out, who effectively, as part of their public relations, they sort of said the open secret, and that is our leverage now with the United States, our leverage in the region is no longer that prospect of a nuclear weapon, what we call breakout capability. They said our leverage with other countries is the Strait of Hormuz. It is the fact that we can have such a significant effect on the global economy, and they will want to convert what they have established with that leverage in early March to a long-term oversight, management, whatever you call it, of the Strait of Hormuz, so that they still have that impact. And let me just put to you how significant that has been. When the U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance effectively has acknowledged the Iranian regime that the US tried to wipe out, when he has effectively said we can deal with the Iranian regime, when he has effectively said we can make a deal with the Iranian regime, look at how much Iran has recovered in terms of its political position compared to where it was on the February the 28th when its supreme leader was assassinated.
Scott Lucas, fascinating as always. Thank you very much for joining us on the program today.
Thank you.